Hey everyone, welcome in. We got the long 4-day weekend, so today's ATW is going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more detail oriented, but I can't think of a better way to enjoy your Sunday or Monday, whenever you're watching this, than talking about the rise of fascism around the world as it pertains to the growth of countries nearing the outbreak of World War II. And I would say always remember that is the underlying theme surrounding today's topic, the growth of fascism as it pertains to World War II's outbreak. We already laid the groundwork for fascism, a very authoritative, dictator-like government, highly efficient, full control of society, totalitarian by nature, extreme conservatism on the right end of the political spectrum. Fascism was born out of the post-World War I era, and it started from Italy, and I think that makes good sense that we begin with Italy. And my plan is here to sort of hit each of our three fascist countries, Italy, Germany, and Japan, briefly, with a higher focus, though, eventually put on Germany. With Italy, since Italy was the birthplace of fascism, the Italians had suffered greatly during World War I. In fact, a lot of the Italian suffering stemmed from the fact that they began the war on the sides of the Germans, but then switched over to the English and French and American side. So Italy was sort of caught in between, and ultimately the Italians suffered great losses, and the trauma, the societal trauma due to the war wreaked havoc on the Italians just as it had done elsewhere in Europe. And that was a point that we ended class with on Thursday. It's the trauma of World War I that really paves the way for fascism to grow. And in Italy, the leader of the fascist movement that spearheaded Italy's movement towards this totalitarian, authoritative government was a former journalist, Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini. That's a name to remember with Italian fascism. Mussolini came to power in 1922, so shortly after the war broke out. Shortly after the war ended, I should say. Mussolini came to power, and it was interesting, the dynamic in Italy, as Mussolini rose in stature and fascism was growing. The Italian king, which Italy still had a monarchy, rather than resign or abdicate the throne, sort of made concessions to allow for Mussolini to take power. And the king just sort of stepped aside as Mussolini came to run the government while the king was still there in presence. It was an interesting dynamic. And as Mussolini's fascist government was instituted and began changing Italian society, people began to truly embrace fascism for a lot of the reasons we discussed on Thursday. Highly efficient government model, the economy was put back on track. I remember my global studies 10th grade teacher, shout out to Mr. Sutla, guy was the man. Mr. Sutla used to tell us that one of the reasons Italians love Mussolini so much is that Mussolini helped make sure the trains ran on time. And that was a cornerstone of the fascist government. But Mussolini also, as we talked about, stifled individual thinking, sorry for the lapse there, stifled free speech, took away a lot of civil liberties. So life under the fascist government in Italy was no dream. But Mussolini also preyed upon people's nationalism in a big way. He pledged to help return Italy to the glory of the former Roman Empire. And that really prompted people's enthusiasm for sacrificing those civil liberties. Plus, Mussolini spoke a great deal about imperialism. And he pledged that Italy was going to look to really get involved in imperialism. And that's one of the key themes of today's conversation, recognizing that by nature, these fascist governments, at first, and I'm going to preface this by saying, please stay with me on this point. At first, these fascist governments came in and they instituted reforms to the government, both in Japan, Italy, Germany, wherever. And at first, they met great success. And Mussolini, and from the outside looking in, people were seeing Italy as a rebuilt nation, thanks to Mussolini. But what we know now, looking back, is that the suppression of civil liberties was a high price. And Italy paved the way for this concept, but it demonstrated how people were willing to trade those civil liberties. They were willing to sacrifice those civil liberties at the cost of progress and at the cost of being rebuilt and having their pride restored. And one way we talked about nationalism being built was through imperialism, conquering others. So eventually, this sort of government model that Mussolini institutes, this government model ultimately is going to manifest itself in Italy trying to become an aggressive power and sort of go after the goal of rebuilding an empire like the Romans once had. So Mussolini sets out to ultimately increase Italy's land territory, and Mussolini does this by looking to conquer territories in Africa. In fact, Italy will imperialize modern-day Libya. Modern-day Libya will be imperialized by Italy. But also, if you recall, there's been one Christian territory in Africa that during the scramble avoided being conquered, and that was the Abyssinia Empire, or as we call it today, Ethiopia. However, in the 1930s, the early 1930s, the Italian fascist government invaded and successfully conquered Ethiopia. And for Mussolini and his new government, that was a big turning point, which they showed their aggressive position on being willing to go out and imperialize, and those themes of nationalism that had inspired so many people to turn over and sacrifice their civil liberties. Mussolini was preying upon that, and in the end, there was very little done to keep him in check. And so Italy's aggressive conquest of African territories is going to wind up leading Italy to become more and more married to another fascist regime that was developing in Germany. But before we get to Germany, let's just quickly talk about Japan, because Japan's version of fascism was unique from the Europeans. The characteristics of Japanese fascist society are identical to that of which the Europeans. Nationalism, imperialism, and the Japanese became very aggressive in expanding, and we'll get to that momentarily. But also, with Japan, we have to sort of think of this as a moment of syncretism, fascism syncretism, because the Japanese, who already had a very unique cultural lifestyle, the Japanese embraced fascist concepts but blended them with their sort of Asian cultural traditions. And one of the most important being the role of the emperor. Since the Meiji Restoration period, the emperor had taken on sort of this mythical status in Japanese culture. And the emperor was perceived to be godlike on earth. And the emperor, under fascism, really extended his power beyond what it was previously. But the key with Japan, and the thing I want you to remember about Japanese society as it shifted towards fascism, Japan, under fascism, the military really became the dominant presence in people's lives. And that is definitely something that occurred in the 1920s and 30s in Japan, as Japan was gearing up for its eventual conquests of neighboring territories, just like Italy had done. Japanese society was moving much more militaristic, and that is probably our best evidence of how fascism was taking root in Japan. There still was strict adherence to the emperor. There was this divine quality about the emperor, and people became ultimately very firm in their ideas about the emperor's divine-like status. And as the emperor passed power along to his military leaders, the military presence in Japan stiffly increased. Japan militarized incredibly fast in the 1930s with the goal of building an Asian New World order. The Japanese really saw themselves as the social Darwinistic, the cheese stands alone sort of in Asia. The Japanese viewed themselves as the most powerful nation. They had validation from the Europeans. And so as fascism is spreading in Japan, a very important characteristic about Japanese culture in this time period is the rise of the military power. And Japanese society becomes dominated by the military. There's forced conscription. Everybody is expected to contribute to the military. Factories are converted for military, purposes, and the Japanese culture and society will shift towards a much more militaristic culture. And that is going to directly lead to eventually what Japan is going to set out to do, which is conquer all of Asia. And for the Japanese, the very first area that they will extend their imperial goals is China. And I'm actually going to give this in-class treatment this week because the invasion of China, which precipitates the Japanese aggressive expansion in Asia, is a brutal story, one that needs to be told in person. But also keep in mind that if this goal of the Japanese, and we'll talk more about this on Tuesday, the goal of the Japanese was to take over Asia. And there were a lot of European powers and America standing in its way. So the Japanese were going to have to clear a path to conquer Asia by invading islands and countries nearby. And that all started with China. But eventually that's going to include Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia. The Japanese are going to become ultra aggressive in their attempt to expand throughout Asia. And that in part, again, is due to the conversion of their society to becoming more fascist, more nationalistic, more militaristic. Ultimately, though, this is going to bring us back to Germany, and I think we all kind of know that this is where we're going to end up here today. Germany was not the first fascist country; Italy was, but Germany would have a sort of a slow progression towards fascism that again was precipitated by World War I. I briefly mentioned that after World War I, the Kaiser abdicated his power, and in stepped a newly elected democratic republic called the Weimar Republic, and the Weimar Republic. We talked about the economic failures. We talked about that, the Weimar Republic was ultimately a scapegoat for what happened with World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. And so beginning in 1923, a fascist group attempted to take over the German government. And this was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, which in German, Putsch is like a coup d'etat. And one of the leaders of this Beer Hall Putsch was Adolf Hitler, who had served in the German military during World War I. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about Hitler in person when we get to this in class on Tuesday, when we talk about German expansion. But Hitler was a young fascist leader, and he was growing in reputation and popularity as a revolutionary, someone who wanted to take over the government and install a brand of fascism. And the party that this fascist group that was on the rise here and led this Beer Hall Putsch was called the Nazi Party, Nazi. And Hitler was gaining a reputation and this following, cult following almost, in Germany for speaking against the Weimar Republic. Now, Hitler and his cohorts failed to take over the government. The Beer Hall Putsch was a failure. But here's a case where sometimes our greatest failures lead to our greatest victories, because Hitler would go to jail. He'd be sentenced to jail. And it was while in jail that he really outlined in a book called Mein Kampf. And in this book, he outlined his entire goals for really creating a new German Reich or empire. And a part of Mein Kampf was the nationalism, the fascism, all those ideas. But also, this is where Hitler began to outline his goals. It's in terms of building like this perfect German society that would be rid of foreigners and rid of impure blood, especially Jewish blood. And Hitler made his goals for this plain as day, right in his book. But it would take years upon Hitler being released from jail for him to build up the momentum that he would need to successfully take over the government. Make no mistake, Hitler was an ambitious, calculating person. And he was released from jail in the mid-1920s. He got out a little bit early. And along the way, Hitler's progression to becoming eventually the head of the German government, it took years in the making. Hitler did not take power immediately. In fact, it wasn't until 1933, as you read in the article from last week, that Hitler actually became the head of the German government. So if you think about the timeline here, Mussolini started fascism in 1922. The Japanese were already in the 1920s moving towards fascism. But the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler didn't actually assume power until 1933. And the way that the Nazis engineered this coup d'etat was unlike anything really in European history. There was no war. There was no assassinations. Rather, Hitler and the Nazis gradually became more popular. They gradually got more votes in Germany's elected government, and eventually the Nazi Party had more seats in their parliament than any other party. And that meant that the Nazis could change the government to the way that they wanted. And that's how Hitler ultimately came to power. The Nazis, through force and intimidation at the ballots, the Nazis voted themselves into power. And then, once in power, the Nazis rewrote the laws, the German Constitution, and that's how Hitler ultimately vaulted into the position of power as the Chancellor and President of Germany. And at that point, there was no more hidden agenda. It was all out dictatorship and fascism. And Hitler, I want to make this point known because people assume that, he started killing people. And yes, the Nazi Party took great measures to clear a path for Hitler. But Hitler's initial power came by changing the laws and winning votes at the ballot boxes. But once in power, that's where the Nazis began to execute their fascist agenda. Almost a carbon copy of what was going on in Italy at the time. The Nazis began to suppress civil liberties, all in the name of the state. The Nazis took away civil liberties. And the best case example of that was in 1935, when the Nuremberg laws were passed. The Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws were designed to strip German Jewish people of their citizenship, take away their rights to own businesses and land. This put a target on every Jewish person's back. The Jewish population in Germany, which was quite heavy in numbers, and we'll talk more about this at some point. We're going to do a whole day on anti-Semitism in European history, as well as what happened to the Jewish population during the war. But know this about Hitler's rise to power. He had outlined his anti-Semitism, his hatred of Jewish people, in his book Mein Kampf. And he had made it well known that he felt that the European Jewish were very responsible for World War I. And in the name of fascism, World War I had triggered all this demand for fascist governments. So here comes Hitler now in power with a chance to influence the law. And the Nuremberg laws were directed to really wipe out Jewish Germans' abilities to own property, have a voice, voting rights. There was no at the time there was no direct murdering or death camps or anything like that. We're still years from that. But this is the first step towards eventually the final solution, which was to eradicate all European Jewish people from the continent, during World War II. So the first step towards that really, though, is this program through the law, the Nuremberg laws. But German Jewish people weren't the only ones who were losing their freedoms, their civil liberties. That's a cornerstone of fascism, as we know. But Hitler got things going. He picked up the German people from their bootstraps, and the economy roared. And civil service projects, civil works projects like the Autobahn, the famous highway where you can drive any speed limit you want. The Autobahn was built in the 1930s, and industries were booming. And the government was shifting more towards fascism, and the military was being rebuilt secretly and against the laws in the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler infused a great deal of enthusiasm within German society to rebuild Germany, and that was arguably his most successful tactic in the 1930s, all while at the same time shielding the rest of the outside world from what was really going on behind closed doors, which were the plans for World War II, which were the suppression of civil liberties, which were the anti-Semitic laws against the Jewish population of Germany. But arguably Hitler's greatest trick that he played on people was convincing everyone of Germany being rebuilt, and no example is better than the 1936 Summer Olympics. In fact, Germany also hosted the Winter Olympics that year, but at the 1936 Summer Olympics, on display was this grandiose presentation of Nazi efficiency. Berlin was sparkling, and the city was spotless, and the trains were running on time. As my teacher, Mr. Sutley, used to say, Germany pulled over, duped the entire world. It was one of the great charlatan acts. What a facade the Germans put up. Everybody thought that Germany had been rebuilt. Hitler was being touted as this mastermind, this great rebuilder. He actually had a lot of support in the United States. There were a lot of people that sympathized with Germany. There were a lot of people that saw what Hitler was doing and believed that he was a sort of a genius. One of those people was Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, two famous Americans from the 1930s. Hitler had a wide support all over the world, and unfortunately, what people didn't realize that we do now is that the plans to invade Czechoslovakia, the plans to invade and take over Poland were all being sort of covered up, and nobody knew at the time what Hitler's true ambitions were. But now we look back and realize that the Olympics and the efficiency and the build-up of the military and the restoration of pride and nationalism after World War I, it was all an act. It was all a way to fool the world into thinking that Hitler was, really turning Germany around for the better. But what we soon will learn in class on Tuesday, once we hit upon Japanese expansion into China, we're going to talk about Hitler's plans to invade and how the Europeans dealt with Hitler once he showed his cards a little bit and revealed that his goals were in fact to invade Czechoslovakia and then Poland. I would just say, this is a longer than usual ATW, so I'm sure there's a lot of notes and I'm sure you'll have questions. Jot down any questions you have. Refer back to that reading. I think we've done a good job cementing fascism, what that meant. And I think we've done a pretty good job to sort of support the ideas that are going to lead to World War II, which is that, out of World War I comes this demand for strict authoritative totalitarian rule in certain countries. It's no coincidence that all three countries mentioned today, Germany, Italy, and Japan, all three of those countries were fascist governments, and all three of those countries are going to be the main aggressors that start World War II. And that's what we're setting up on Tuesday. What were the real key events in Asia and Europe that triggered the outbreak of World War? And then we'll be into the World Wars. We'll be going through that this week. Just keep in mind on Friday, we have a multiple choice test, and this is all fair game. So we've got that big multiple choice test on Friday. The following week, we've got we got a DBQ in class, and we're going to make sure we also work on LEQ at some point this week and do a practice one, in class and grade it for homework. We got a lot of work ahead of us, and we're coming down. We're now under almost to a month. We're back in school on Tuesday. It will be a month till the AP. So let's do a good job with this video. I hope you guys have a great rest of your 4-day weekend. We'll see you back on Tuesday. As always, everyone, the past shapes the future. Take care and enjoy the rest of your weekend.